On a routine flight, everything seemed calm at first. The plane had just finished boarding and was about to taxi when an unexpected delay was announced due to weather conditions. Passengers settled into their seats, some staring out the windows, others scrolling through their phones, and a few chatting quietly. Among them was a black man who seemed to be minding his own business, quietly reading a book. He was dressed in a smart jacket and appeared to be on a business trip, like many others on the flight. His demeanor was calm, and he wasn't drawing any attention to himself. He just wanted to get to his destination without any trouble. A few rows ahead, an off-duty police officer sat in his seat, looking around the cabin. He wasn't a passenger on this flight, just a man returning home from a few days off, enjoying his time away from work. He had worked in law enforcement for years, and like many of his colleagues, prided himself on his ability to stay alert to his surroundings. However, that day, something felt off to him. The man sitting across the aisle, reading his book, caught the officer's eye. There was no immediate reason for concern. He wasn't acting suspiciously, nor was he causing any disturbance. But for some reason, the officer's gaze lingered on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The officer's mind began to race. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he found himself making assumptions, influenced by what he had seen in the media and heard from his peers. He had grown accustomed to thinking in certain patterns, even if those patterns weren't always based on facts. The man on the plane seemed calm, but the officer felt a sense of unease. Maybe it was how the man reached for his bag in the overhead compartment, or the way he glanced around the cabin. Nothing about the situation screamed danger, but the officer couldn't help feeling that something was off. His instincts, as he had been taught to trust, told him to keep watching the man closely. The officer began to think that perhaps the man was hiding something. Maybe he was carrying something illegal or trying to blend in with the crowd. The officer told himself that he had seen enough to know when something wasn't right. Yet, in reality, there was no real reason to be suspicious. The man hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply going about his day, like everyone else on the plane. But the officer's growing discomfort pushed him further into the realm of assumptions. He wasn't about to let this feeling go, even though it wasn't based on any facts or solid evidence. As the flight took off and the plane climbed into the air, the officer's suspicion didn't subside. In fact, it grew stronger, making him even more uneasy. The longer he stared at the man, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. His mind was clouded by thoughts that weren't grounded in reality. He had no proof that the man had done anything wrong, but his instinct kept telling him otherwise. The officer told himself that maybe he was just being extra cautious, but deep down, he knew that the feelings of unease were fueled more by prejudice than any real sense of danger. The man, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the officer's growing concerns. He continued reading, occasionally looking out the window at the passing clouds. Everything seemed fine. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet, peaceful journey was about to be interrupted by someone else's unfounded suspicions. Little did he know that the officer's assumptions were about to turn a simple flight into something far more complicated. As the flight continued, the officer couldn't shake the uneasy feeling he had about the man sitting across the aisle. His suspicions had only grown, even though there was nothing to indicate that the man had done anything wrong. Still, something inside him told him to act. The officer wasn't on duty, but he still felt an overpowering urge to do something. He told himself that maybe he was just being cautious, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He tried to push it to the back of his mind, but every time he glanced at the man, he felt a sense of discomfort. Finally, after several minutes of deliberating in his mind, the officer decided he needed to approach the man. He stood up from his seat, scanning the cabin one last time to make sure no one was watching too closely. He began to walk down the aisle toward the man who had been reading quietly, unaware of the officer's growing suspicions. The flight attendants, busy with their own tasks, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. The other passengers, too, were lost in their own worlds, their faces buried in their phones or books. The officer reached the man's seat, standing for a moment before he spoke. His voice was firm, almost demanding, as he addressed the man. "I need to see your identification," he said, without any explanation or context. The man looked up from his book, surprised by the sudden demand. He didn't understand why he was being asked to show his ID, especially when he hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. "What's this about?" the man asked, his voice calm but confused. He wasn't angry, just puzzled by the officer's insistence. The officer, feeling his suspicion grow stronger, didn't offer any explanation. "I said I need to see your ID," he repeated, his tone now more insistent. The man, still not understanding what was happening, complied. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID, thinking perhaps there was some kind of misunderstanding or that it was a simple mistake. But the officer didn't look at the ID right away. Instead, he stared at the man for a few moments, as if looking for something, anything, that would confirm his suspicion. But the man remained calm and collected, nothing in his actions or demeanor suggesting that he was a threat. The officer didn't seem satisfied with just the ID, though. He started to ask more questions, pressing the man for answers. "What are you doing on this flight? Where are you headed?" he asked, though these were questions that no one else would ever be asked. Other passengers, still unaware of what was happening, began to shift in their seats, sensing the growing tension. Some of them looked up, but most were too nervous to speak out. The man, still confused but not wanting to escalate the situation, answered the officer's questions politely, explaining that he was on a business trip. He didn't know why he was being singled out, but he tried his best to stay calm. He explained his purpose, his destination, and his itinerary, but the officer wasn't satisfied. He started accusing the man of being uncooperative, despite the fact that the man had done nothing but answer his questions. Other passengers were now beginning to take notice of the confrontation. Some of them quietly murmured to each other, sensing that something wasn't right. A few passengers even began to take out their phones, recording what was happening. But the officer, now frustrated, didn't back down. He seemed determined to escalate the situation. His voice grew louder, and the man, still bewildered by the whole ordeal, began to feel the pressure building. He had done nothing wrong, but somehow he was being treated like a criminal. The officer's demeanor became more aggressive, his accusations more pointed. At this point, the flight attendants stepped in, trying to calm the situation down. But the officer, unwilling to let go of his suspicions, insisted that the man was causing a disturbance. He demanded that the man leave his seat, and it was clear that he wasn't going to back down without taking further action. The man, now more confused than ever, tried to explain himself, but the officer wasn't listening. The situation, which had started so calmly, was now on the verge of becoming something much more serious. The tension on the plane was palpable, and the other passengers were beginning to realize that things were spiraling out of control. The situation continued to escalate quickly. The officer's tone grew more commanding, and his body language became more forceful. The man, still trying to understand why he was being treated this way, felt a wave of confusion and frustration wash over him. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet, here he was, being accused of causing trouble for simply sitting on a plane. He had always prided himself on staying calm in tough situations, but this was different. The officer was making it clear that he wasn't going to let the man leave without some kind of confrontation. As the officer continued to insist that the man leave his seat, the man began to feel a deep sense of unease. He knew that things were getting out of hand, but he wasn't sure how to defuse the situation without making it worse. He felt the weight of the officer's accusations bearing down on him. Other passengers were beginning to notice, some shifting in their seats uncomfortably as the tension grew. A few of them had their phones out, recording what was happening, but no one seemed to know how to intervene. The flight attendants, trying their best to calm things down, seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. They had dealt with all kinds of customer complaints and issues before, but this was something entirely different. The officer was not backing down, and neither was the man. At that moment, the man decided to remain calm, hoping that if he stayed composed, the officer might reconsider his actions. He took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not sure why you're doing this," he said, looking the officer in the eye. "I'm just here to take a flight, like everyone else." His words were meant to remind the officer that there was no reason for all of this. He was simply a man traveling on a plane, like dozens of others. But the officer wasn't listening. His mind was clouded by his assumptions and his determination to follow through with his suspicion. The officer's hand hovered near the man's arm, and the man, instinctively, pulled away slightly, not wanting to feel restrained. The officer, interpreting this movement as resistance, became more forceful in his demands. "I'm asking you to leave the plane." "Now," he said, his voice sharp. The man, now more than ever, felt that he had no choice but to comply. He didn't want to escalate things further, especially with so many eyes on them. Slowly, he stood up, his heart racing. He tried to stay composed, but the anger inside him was building. He had been wrongfully accused, treated with suspicion for no reason, and now he was being asked to leave the flight. As the man was escorted down the aisle, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder. Some of them were speaking in hushed tones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. No one could understand why this was happening. The man, who had been quietly reading his book just moments before, was now being forced off the plane. His mind raced. Why was this happening to him? Was it because of the way he looked? Was it because of who he was? All he wanted was to get to his destination without being treated like a criminal. Yet here he was, walking down the aisle with a police officer at his side, surrounded by passengers who were witnessing a situation that didn't make sense. The flight attendants, standing near the front of the plane, were visibly uncomfortable. They had seen disagreements before, but this was different. They had no idea why the officer was so adamant about removing the man, but they felt helpless in this moment. One of the attendants approached the officer, trying to de-escalate the situation, but the officer ignored her attempts. It was clear that he had made up his mind, and there was no turning back. As the man was led off the plane, he couldn't help but feel humiliated. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated as if he were guilty of something. He felt a sense of disbelief wash over him. How could this be happening? How could one person's assumptions lead to all of this? But there was no time to dwell on those questions now. He had to focus on what was happening in the present moment. As he stepped off the plane, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, many of them watching the entire scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and concern. As the man stepped off the plane, his heart was heavy with confusion. The cool airport air hit him as he walked down the jet bridge, still in shock over what had just happened. He had been removed from the flight without any explanation, accused of something he had never done. The officer walked beside him, his presence still imposing. The man tried to collect his thoughts, but everything felt like a blur. He kept replaying the moments on the plane in his mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. As they reached the terminal, the officer told him to wait by a gate while he made a phone call. The man, still processing what had just occurred, stood there alone, looking around at the busy airport. People were rushing past him, oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded. He tried to make sense of the situation, but it didn't add up. What had caused the officer to treat him like this? He thought about the conversations he'd had with other passengers before boarding, how everything had seemed so normal. He had no idea why the officer had singled him out, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It wasn't long before the airport staff approached. The officer had called in backup, and now the man was facing more questions. Airport security had arrived, looking confused and unsure of what had happened. They had no idea why this man had been pulled off the plane in the first place. As the officer began to explain the situation, the security personnel listened carefully. They could tell that the officer's version of events didn't make much sense, and they began to ask their own questions. The man, still trying to remain calm, explained his side of the story. He told them that he had been reading his book when the officer had approached him, demanding to see his ID. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The security officers exchanged glances, their confusion clear. They knew that something wasn't right, but they didn't have enough information to take action just yet. The officer, on the other hand, was growing more defensive. He continued to insist that the man was being uncooperative, even though the man had done nothing but answer his questions politely. The tension between them was palpable. The man's frustration was growing, but he knew that if he didn't stay calm, things would only get worse. Meanwhile, some passengers who had witnessed the incident started to gather near the gate, whispering among themselves. They were still trying to process what had happened. Several of them had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and now some of them were talking about what they had seen. They couldn't understand why the man had been singled out. Many of them had never seen anything like this before. They were all aware that there had been no real reason for the officer's actions, but none of them had been brave enough to speak up while it was happening. The man, who had been trying to remain calm throughout the ordeal, now felt the weight of the situation even more. He wasn't just dealing with his own frustration and confusion, but also with a growing awareness of how unfairly he had been treated. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that his race had played a role in the officer's decision to target him. He had been stereotyped, judged before even being given a chance to explain himself. That realization stung more than anything. As the officer spoke with airport security, the man tried to take deep breaths, fighting back the anger rising within him. He knew that he was in a difficult position. The officer had already made up his mind, and it seemed that no matter what he said or did, the situation wouldn't be resolved easily. The security officers seemed reluctant to challenge the officer's actions, but their uncertainty was evident. The man could see it in their eyes. This wasn't right, and they knew it. The tension in the air was thick, and the situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. More security staff arrived, but it didn't help ease the man's growing sense of disbelief. He never imagined that something as simple as being on a flight could turn into such an ordeal. As the minutes passed, he began to wonder if he would ever be able to get back on that plane, or if his journey had come to an end. The anger and confusion continued to boil inside him, but he fought to remain composed. His only hope now was that the situation would eventually be resolved, and that the truth would come to light. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about getting back on the plane. It was about something far more important. It was about standing up for what was right. The minutes stretched on as the man stood by the gate, surrounded by airport security, the officer, and a growing crowd of passengers. The situation had quickly become something much larger than anyone had expected. The man felt like he was being pushed into a corner, but he tried his best to stay composed. His mind was racing, still trying to figure out what had happened and why this was happening to him. What had he done wrong? Why was he being treated this way? Every time he thought he might get an answer, the situation seemed to grow more complicated. Some of the passengers who had witnessed the whole ordeal were still standing nearby, talking quietly among themselves. They couldn't understand what had happened. Most of them had seen the same things. The officer had singled the man out for no reason. And now, the man was being questioned like he was a criminal. A few passengers approached the man, offering him sympathetic looks or quietly asking if he was okay. It was clear they didn't think he should have been removed from the plane in the first place. A couple of people mentioned how strange it was that the officer hadn't even given the man a chance to explain himself before demanding his ID and asking all those questions. One passenger, a woman who had been sitting a few rows behind the man, finally spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking a little. "I saw everything. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just sitting there, reading his book." She paused for a moment, glancing at the officer, then back at the man. "I don't understand why you're treating him like this." The officer, who had been busy explaining his side of the story to the airport security staff, turned sharply at the woman's words. His face tightened, but he didn't say anything immediately. The woman's statement had made things awkward, and the officer could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. For the first time, he seemed to pause, perhaps questioning if he had overstepped. But his pride and determination not to back down from his position kept him from admitting he might have been wrong. The security officers looked at each other, and it was clear they were starting to question the officer's actions. The more the passengers spoke out, the more they realized that something didn't add up. The officer's story seemed to fall apart. There was no evidence of any wrongdoing, and the witnesses were all saying the same thing. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened before the officer intervened. The man was just an ordinary passenger who had been singled out for reasons no one could understand. The man, still standing off to the side, was listening to the conversation, but he couldn't fully process it. It was like the whole world was happening around him, and he was just an observer in his own life. But as he heard the passengers speak out, he began to feel a shift. Maybe there was still hope for some kind of resolution. Maybe things could be sorted out. But the more the officer resisted, the more the man realized that this wouldn't be an easy fix. It was clear that the officer had made his mind up, and no amount of evidence or testimony was going to change that. The frustration continued to build inside him. He hadn't expected to find himself in a situation like this, where something as simple as being on a flight turned into a battle of principle. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Not at the officer necessarily, but at the system that allowed this to happen. He began to think about all the people who had been treated unfairly like this, all the times that assumptions and stereotypes had led to unnecessary conflict. He was just one man, but his situation felt bigger than himself now. The security officers had finally gathered enough information to know that there was no reason for the man to be removed from the plane. They began to speak with the officer, trying to get him to back down. At this point, the officer had no choice but to admit that he had acted prematurely. His actions had no real basis, and now it was clear that he had made a mistake. The man, still standing in the terminal, was trying to stay composed, but the emotions were beginning to surge. He had been humiliated, his dignity taken from him without cause. He just wanted to be treated fairly, just like everyone else. After several more minutes of back and forth, the officer finally seemed to realize that his actions had gone too far. His face flushed with frustration as the reality of his mistake settled in. He had caused a scene, made a passenger feel small, and all for no reason. The security officers, now firm in their decision, told the officer that he had no grounds to keep the man off the plane any longer. After what felt like an eternity, the man was finally told he could return to the plane. The officer, who had been so determined to have the man removed, stepped aside without another word, his face tight with discomfort. It was clear he wasn't happy with how the situation had turned out, but there was no denying that he had been wrong. The man, still shaken but relieved, nodded to the security officers, who gave him a sympathetic glance. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation, but at least now, he was going to get back on his flight. As he made his way back down the terminal to reboard, he noticed the other passengers still watching. Some of them smiled at him, offering silent support, while others simply stared, unsure of what had just happened. It was a strange mix of emotions. The man felt the weight of their stares, but he also felt a sense of solidarity. He had stood up for himself, and it seemed that others were beginning to understand just how wrong this whole situation had been. When he reached the gate, the flight attendants greeted him with polite smiles, but there was a noticeable awkwardness in the air. They had witnessed the whole ordeal, and even though they hadn't been able to intervene, they knew that the officer's actions had been out of line. They didn't say anything, but their silent acknowledgement made the man feel like he wasn't alone in this. He had been caught up in a situation that no one could have predicted, but now it felt like people were starting to recognize the injustice of it all. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt a sense of cautious relief. He didn't know what kind of reception he would receive from the other passengers, but he was just thankful that he could sit back down and try to move past what had happened. When he reached his seat, a few of the passengers around him nodded or gave him quiet looks of understanding. No one said anything out loud, but it was clear that many of them were still processing the events. They had seen firsthand how the officer had overstepped his authority, and now some of them seemed to be quietly acknowledging the man's right to stand up for himself. The flight finally took off, but the man couldn't relax completely. His mind kept replaying the events that had unfolded, the confusion, the anger, the sense of powerlessness. How had it all escalated so quickly? He kept wondering if there was something more he could have done, something he missed in the moment that could have stopped the situation from spiraling out of control. But deep down, he knew that there wasn't. The officer had made up his mind, and no matter what the man had said or done, the officer had already decided to target him. It wasn't about what he had done. It was about something deeper, something ingrained in the way people were judged by their appearance, by assumptions that were made without any real cause. As the flight moved along, the man found himself thinking about the larger implications of what had happened. He wasn't just a passenger on a plane. He was a symbol of a much larger problem that had been happening for years. He thought about how often people were judged unfairly because of their race, how many times individuals were singled out simply because of how they looked. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was part of a bigger pattern, a system that needed to change. The man knew that speaking out about what happened could make a difference, but he also understood how difficult it could be to get people to listen. The plane eventually reached its destination, and the man stepped off, his legs a little shaky, but his head held high. He had survived the ordeal, but the emotional toll was still there. As he walked through the airport, he thought about what came next. He knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't just move on as if it hadn't happened. He had been wrongfully accused, humiliated in front of strangers, and treated unfairly by someone in a position of power. But despite the anger that still bubbled inside him, the man also felt a sense of empowerment. He had stood up for himself when it mattered most, and that was something not everyone had the strength to do. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this experience had taught him something important about the world and about himself. It wasn't always easy to stand up for what was right, but sometimes that was exactly what needed to be done. And as he walked out of the airport, he couldn't help but wonder, what if more people spoke up when they saw something wrong? What if more people refused to be silent when they were treated unfairly? Maybe then, things would start to change. Maybe then, incidents like the one he had just experienced wouldn't happen as often. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most important lesson he could take away from the whole ordeal. The man walked out of the airport, his mind still processing everything that had happened. His steps were slow, heavy, as he moved through the crowds of people who were oblivious to the emotional storm he had just weathered. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also a lingering sadness. He had been humiliated, accused unjustly, and forced to prove his innocence. But now, as he walked through the terminal, something began to change inside him. He wasn't sure exactly what it was. Maybe it was the realization that he had made it through the ordeal, or maybe it was the understanding that he had stood up for himself when no one else would. Either way, he felt a new sense of determination beginning to form. He knew the emotional weight of the situation wouldn't just disappear. It wasn't something he could easily forget, not after everything that had unfolded. But at least now, he felt like he had taken a stand. He hadn't allowed the officer to walk all over him, hadn't let his dignity be stripped away. That thought stayed with him as he made his way outside, his bag in hand, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what still needed to be done. As he waited for his ride to arrive, he thought back to the passengers who had spoken up. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to come forward and tell the truth, but they had. Some of them had even quietly recorded the incident, keeping evidence that could have proved his case. He appreciated their support, even though he hadn't asked for it. In a world where it often felt like people looked the other way when something wasn't right, those passengers had chosen to do something. They had seen the injustice unfold and made the decision to not stay silent. The man wondered if he would have been able to do the same in their position. It made him think about how many times in life people stayed quiet when they saw something wrong. How often had he himself turned a blind eye to injustice, choosing to stay out of it rather than speaking up? But this experience had opened his eyes. Sometimes, staying silent wasn't an option. The man realized that if he had stayed quiet, if he had just accepted what the officer had done without challenging it, things would have turned out very differently. It wasn't always easy to speak out, but this incident had taught him that speaking up could make a difference. As he walked through the parking lot to where his ride was waiting, he found himself thinking about the bigger picture. The officer's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a wider issue of bias and discrimination that happened every day, often without anyone noticing. The man had experienced it firsthand, but so many others were living through the same kind of injustice, often without any way to fight back. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to not let this be the end of his story. He couldn't just move on without trying to make sure something like this didn't happen again. He knew that taking action wouldn't be easy. It would take time and effort, and it would mean putting himself in uncomfortable situations. But as he climbed into the car that would take him home, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He didn't want his story to be just a personal victory. He wanted it to be something that helped others, too. He wanted to speak out for those who couldn't, for those who didn't have the chance to stand up and fight back when they were treated unfairly. He wanted to be part of a change that would make sure no one else had to go through what he had. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the car's engine a constant, steady rhythm. The man sat back, staring out the window, lost in thought. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was beautiful, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about how the world could be better, how people could treat each other with more kindness, more fairness. Maybe it was an impossible dream, but it was a dream worth having. As the car pulled into his driveway, the man took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He had made it through one of the hardest moments of his life, but more importantly, he had come out stronger on the other side. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that no matter what happened, he would never stop fighting for what was right. He would make sure his voice was heard, even if it was difficult. Because in the end, that was the only way to create real change, and that was something worth fighting for. The man's life began to return to a sense of normalcy, but the experience he had gone through was far from forgotten. It lingered in his thoughts like a shadow, following him everywhere he went. He tried to focus on the day-to-day tasks, the small moments that used to feel routine, but they no longer held the same weight. He couldn't simply forget what had happened, nor could he ignore the deeper issues it had brought to the surface. As the days passed, the memory of the incident stayed with him. It had shaken him, yes, but it also sparked something inside him. A desire to make sure it didn't happen again, not just to him, but to anyone else. He began to do more research to learn about the bigger issues at play. He discovered that what he had experienced was part of a wider, troubling pattern: racial profiling, systemic bias, and unfair treatment based on assumptions about people's appearances. It was a harsh reality, one that he hadn't fully understood before, but now it was something he couldn't ignore. The man realized that the officer's actions weren't just personal prejudice. They were part of a larger issue that affected countless people every day. He thought about the passengers who had spoken up for him, how their voices had been the reason the situation hadn't spiraled completely out of control. They had chosen to stand up, even when it wasn't their fight. It made him think about how often people turned a blind eye when they saw something wrong. He had done it himself in the past, not wanting to get involved, not wanting to make waves. But now he understood how important it was to speak out, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, as he sat in his living room, the man decided he couldn't just let the issue fade away. He began drafting a letter to the airline, detailing what had happened and expressing his concerns about how the situation was handled. He knew that one letter wouldn't change everything, but it was a start. His thoughts turned to others who had been mistreated in similar ways, others who might not have the voice or platform to speak out. He wondered if his experience could inspire someone else to stand up too. He also started to reach out to organizations that work toward racial equality and justice. He wanted to get involved, to be part of a movement that was bigger than his own personal experience. It wasn't enough to just tell his story. He wanted to take action, to help create real change. The man knew it would be a long journey, but he felt ready. The fire that had been ignited in him after the incident wasn't something that would easily burn out. It was a spark that had been waiting for the right moment to catch fire. In the weeks that followed, the man found himself talking more and more about the incident. He shared his story with friends, family, and anyone who would listen. His voice grew stronger, more confident, as he talked about how important it was to challenge unjust actions and systems. He realized that it wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the bigger picture. It was about making sure that people were treated fairly, no matter their race, background, or appearance. The response to his story was mixed. Some people were supportive, offering words of encouragement and gratitude for his willingness to speak up. Others, however, were uncomfortable. They didn't understand why he had made such a big deal out of the situation. They suggested he should have just moved on and not let it bother him. But the man knew he couldn't simply move on. He couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. This wasn't just about his personal experience. It was about something much bigger that affected so many people every day. As time passed, the man's resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't going to let this be the end of his story. He began to look for more ways to get involved in activism, attending local meetings, speaking at events, and becoming part of a growing network of individuals who were committed to making a difference. His story wasn't just his own anymore. It was part of a larger conversation about racial justice and equality. The man realized that his voice had power, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Through it all, the man remained determined to make a difference. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to take the steps necessary to create change. The experience that had once made him feel small, humiliated, and powerless had transformed him into someone who was determined to make sure that others never had to go through the same thing. And in that, he found purpose. A purpose that would drive him forward no matter the obstacles. The man's journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Months passed, and the man's life had taken a turn he hadn't expected. What began as a humiliating and confusing encounter had transformed into something much bigger. The more he spoke out about what had happened to him, the more he realized how many others had similar stories. His voice had become part of a movement, one that was focused on fighting discrimination and promoting fairness. He had started to reach people who had never thought much about racial profiling, and now they were listening. But the journey wasn't easy. It was a challenge, and at times it felt like the weight of it all was too much to bear. There were still those who didn't understand the depth of the problem, those who told him he should just let it go. Some even accused him of making too much of a small incident. But the man knew it wasn't small. The way he had been treated, wrongfully accused and humiliated, was a reflection of something much larger, a problem that had been brewing for years. This wasn't just about one officer or one bad experience. It was about an entire system that was often blind to the everyday struggles of people who were treated unfairly because of their race or appearance. The more he learned, the more passionate he became. He started attending meetings, joining rallies, and talking to others who were dedicated to the cause. His experience on the plane had opened his eyes to the ways society was often divided. He met people who had faced similar struggles, and their stories touched him deeply. They shared their pain and frustration, and in return, he shared his own. Each time he spoke out, he felt a sense of solidarity with others, a feeling that they were all fighting for the same thing. But there were also moments of doubt. There were times when he questioned whether any of it would make a difference. Sometimes the path forward felt unclear, and the man wondered if he was really having an impact. The fight for equality and justice was a long and difficult road, and there were no guarantees that things would change quickly or even in his lifetime. But in those moments of uncertainty, he reminded himself of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about instant change. It was about building a future where things could be better, where people wouldn't have to experience what he had gone through. Then came the day when the airline finally responded to his letter. The company apologized for the way he had been treated and assured him that they would be taking steps to address the issue. They promised to review their training programs for employees and make sure that something like this wouldn't happen again. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. For the man, it was a small victory. It showed that speaking out had led to some kind of change. His voice, along with the voices of others, had made a difference. The man didn't stop there, though. He continued to work with organizations that were dedicated to fighting racial injustice. He started to see the impact of his efforts, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others as well. People were starting to pay attention to the things that he had once been too afraid to speak about. He began to realize that even small actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that he never expected. One day, as he walked through a busy street, he saw a group of young people handing out flyers for a protest. They were speaking out against racial injustice, sharing information, and calling for change. The man smiled to himself. A year ago, he would have walked past them without a second thought. But now, he knew that what they were doing was important. He had become part of something much larger than himself, a movement that was pushing for change and fighting for equality. Looking back on everything, the man realized that his experience had not only changed him, but it had also opened his eyes to the power of collective action. It wasn't just about his own fight. It was about standing together, supporting one another, and speaking up when something was wrong. He'd have started as one person with one story, but now he was part of a larger community of people who were determined to make a difference. And as he walked on, he felt a quiet sense of pride. The road ahead was still long, and there was still work to be done. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking it alone. The man had found his purpose, and it was something worth fighting for.